Dr. Jim Gage is past president of the Academy in 1991. A pediatric orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Gage is best known for his pioneering work in gait analysis and the development of the first clinical gait labs for cerebral palsy. His many accomplishments were recognized by the Academy in 2016 when he received its Lifetime Achievement Award. Dr. Gage's career began at Newington Children's Hospital in Newington, Connecticut, where early on he learned from families and therapists alike that children with CP were having multiple surgeries with lengthy recoveries throughout their childhood and often with poor outcomes. Therapists saw their jobs as to keep the children away from the surgeons. Dr. Gage set out to find a better way. This led him on a career trajectory towards gait analysis as a clinical approach to assess and help determine the best treatment for the child. In 1990, his career took him back home to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he accepted the post of medical director of Gillette Children's Specialty Hospital. There, he continued his pioneering work in gait and became known as a champion of multidisciplinary care, recognizing that a collaborative process to treating spasticity would ultimately improve surgical outcomes. In 1991, Dr. Gage published through Matt Keith Press a monograph of his experiences with gait. In 2003, his work was expanded to the comprehensive, multi-authored text, The Treatment of Gait Problems in Cerebral Palsy. This definitive guide was updated again in 2009 with his colleagues from around the world. Beginning in 1996 and extending for the next 18 years, he had the opportunity to volunteer with a minimum of 3 weeks annually in Ecuador, where he performed surgeries on children with CP from impoverished areas. These annual trips soon expanded to include U.S. colleagues as well as South American pediatric orthopedic surgeons who came to Ecuador to learn and work with him, ultimately helping many children in many South American countries to receive better care. Dr. Gage and his wife Shirley live in St. Paul, Minnesota. He volunteers at Habitat for Humanity, is an avid cyclist, and he continues to enjoy computers and orthopedics. He has 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. Well, may I begin with the first question?
By all means.
Your route to treat patients with cerebral palsy was a little bit about avoiding things that you didn't want to do, like scoliosis. Can you tell us about how you got there?
Yes, it was rather curious. I started out in general orthopedics. I took a job after my residency here in Twin Cities, and for 5 years I practiced general orthopedics. But in our practice back in those days, we had a day that we dedicated to, charity or whatever, I guess. And so one of my partners worked at the VA hospital. I happened to work at Gillette Children's Hospital. And in those days, we didn't have specialized pediatric orthopedists. So Bob Winter, who was the medical director of the hospital at that time, would assign you to a specialized service. So I was assigned to the hip service, which was sort of isolated hip problems like cerebral palsy, developmental dysplasia of the hip, et cetera, like Perthes. And what would happen is they would send you once a year to a meeting as a thank you, but that meeting had to be concerned with pediatric hips. And at one of those meetings, I met a gentleman by the name of Jim Drennan, who was currently full-time at Newington Children's Hospital, and he had visited our hospital at one time, and so we got to be kind of friends, and we happened to get a ride to the airport together, and we were sitting there waiting for planes. And I was saying, well, you got a nice life, you've got residents, you don't have an emergency room, it sounds very pleasant. He said, would you like to do it? And I said, what do you mean? And next thing I knew, I said, no, I'm fine. I bought the house. I said, my wife said she'd follow me anywhere as long as it was South Minneapolis. And so I said, I'm set. And but then I started getting urges to come out and look at Newington Children's Hospital. And so eventually I told my wife, Mary, that I'd better go out and look at it, because for some reason they were after me. And so I went out there, and they offered me a position, and I looked around, and it would be full-time pediatric orthopedics. And so I came back and said, you know, it would be fun, but you know, we're settled and we're here, so we'll stay here. And then about 3 months later, so I turned them down anyway. About 3 months later, they called me and said, would you still consider the job, or what do you think about it? And so then we went out together, and eventually, long story short, we ended up moving to Connecticut full time. By that time, I had a child that was just going into 7th grade. I had my youngest was in 2nd grade. Next one was in 3rd. So it was kind of a tumultuous move, and it came with a significant salary cut. But when I got out there, I asked Dr. Curtis, who was the medical director, why they courted me. I said, you're 90 miles from Harvard and 30 miles from Yale. Why didn't you get one of those bright people that are coming out? And he said, well, you trained with Bob Winter, who's internationally known in scoliosis. He said, we're looking for somebody to do our scoliosis. And I said, I don't like scoliosis. I said, and I don't do scoliosis. I said, I trained in it, but I said, if you're living in Minneapolis and you've got Winter and Moe in Minneapolis, they're doing scoliosis, and we're sending our patients there. And Burr was Northern Irish, and when he got upset, his hair would kind of turn whiter than it usually was, and his face would turn redder. And he did that chameleon change in front of me. And then he said, well, we would presume that anyone who had trained with Bob Winter would be thoroughly updated in scoliosis and prepared to do our scoliosis. So I had taken the job. There wasn't much I could do at that point, but it was still 4 months away from the move. So I called Bob Winter and said, I'm changing my day off from Tuesday to Thursday. And I said, I'm going to be doing scoliosis with you every time you're at Gillette for 4 months. And so that was my initiation to scoliosis, but I never enjoyed doing scoliosis. It's kind of like being a pilot, you know, 95% of the time bored to death, you're sort of cleaning the skeleton and scraping bones, getting ready for a fusion. 5% of the time scared to death because you're cranking that rod up and hoping you're not going to cause a neurological problem. And so from the beginning, I was looking for a way out, but it took, I came there in 76, and it wasn't until about 3 years later that I got an opportunity to, the head of the CP service was resigning, and so we had hired one of our fellows who would like scoliosis, and Tom Renshaw. So I went in, and by that time Burr Curtis was gone, and we had a new medical director. And I asked Dr. Kramer if I could have the directorship of the cerebral palsy service, and his reply was, you don't know a damn thing about cerebral palsy. And I said, well, I'll learn. And so that was the beginning of my cerebral palsy career.
That's pretty amazing. And you've told me a little bit about, you know, what you first learned when you went into that business of treating cerebral palsy, and what the parents were saying to you and the families were saying to you.
Well, I mean, the first thing I looked at was the size of the service, and I noticed that over many years it hadn't grown, and about the same number were entering every year as leaving. And so I set about interviewing parents, and in general, I found that they were rather unhappy with the treatment, that their expectations were far above what they were seeing. And so next I started interviewing the therapists, and some of them told me quite frankly that they saw their chief job as keeping the patients away from surgery, and which I guess is a good goal. But at any rate, so, and it became apparent that you take a child, with spastic diplegia, for example, and they'd walk similarly, and you'd examine them and they'd examine similarly, and you do sort of the same surgeries on two, and one would be better and one would be worse. And I kind of decided it was like trying to do cardiac surgery with a stethoscope, you know, not having any more advanced treatment than that.
Yeah.
So then I went up and I asked Dr. Kramer if I could go visit the West Coast Gait labs, because Gene Black and Stanford was supposedly doing gait analysis, although his lab was never up and running the many times I visited. And Jackie Perry had an EMG video lab, which was very active, but she didn't have anything that really resembled motion analysis. And she was in Downey, California, which is just south of Los Angeles. And then David Sutherland down in San Diego had an operational gait lab, but the problem is you have 22 markers on these kids. You can see about 12 of them on any view. You have to have 3 views, front, right, and left. You have to have 3 seconds of each view. And those markers all have to be digitized. And the frames are running at about 30 frames per second. So if you start doing the math, there's about 10,000 markers that have to be entered into the computer, and they were entering them manually. They had college students, and they had an XY plotter on the computer, so the Y-axis and the X-axis, and you had a device with a crosshairs on it, and you had to cover the marker and press a button, and that put the marker into the computer. And so it took 3 seconds to do a walk, and they had to have at least 3 walks. And the long and the short of it, it wasn't clinically applicable. And then they had then to somehow tie that together to the EMG and the force plates. They weren't sort of intrinsically bound together with the program. So, but you know, what he could see and what he, about a child, once he got all this, was far above what we could do.
Yeah.
So then I went back, and Bob Kramer had recently taken over from Dr. Curtis, who had retired. And I said, well, I think we have to have a gait laboratory if we're going to really do cerebral palsy well. And he said, how much would one cost? And I said, oh, probably maximum $150,000. Well, we had a part of the hospital that the hospital had been rebuilt about 6 years before, and part of the hospital had been left unfinished. So there was a place to put it. And I think Bob was looking for a program because he was a new medical director. And so he said, well, why don't you see what you can do? And as it happened, I used to play tennis with a guy back in Minnesota, and who was vice president control data. And so I went back to see him, and I said, asked if he could help. And so he actually sent an engineer out to look at it for about a week. And then he said, well, he says, you're really too far away and the project is huge. And he says, we can't really help you much. So anyway, then, but he said, why don't you look into, you know, sources clear by. So at any rate, I went back to Dr. Kramer, and United Technologies Research Center was right across the river in East Hartford, and he invited, they had an 11 corporation there. I mean, it was a corporation included 11 different companies. And companies like Otis Elevators, Sikorsky Helicopter, Hamilton Standard. And so anyway, long story short, we invited, they had a research division that did research for the other 10 corporations. And they invited, or I'm sorry, Bob Kramer invited the head of the research division to come over and look at the project. And when he came over, I was explaining the project, and I said, we got to track these moving markers. And he explained that his name was Wes Kurt. And he explained that, he says, if we can track moving parts in a jet engine, I don't see a lot of problem with that. And I had said, well, you don't know much about cerebral palsy. And he says, well, it just so happens my sister Prudence Kurt was the head of your therapy department for 20 years. She just retired. She's now a missionary in Africa.
Wow.
And so anyway, he kind of wanted to do the project. And so he went back to Harry Gray, who was the head of the whole 11 corporation or 11 company corporation. And kind of sold him on the project, I think, because they were trying to do robotic welding, and they were having trouble getting the robot to follow the seam that they were trying to weld. And he thought, he told Dr. Gray that he thought the visual part of this might be worthwhile. And so, at any rate, he came back and said, we'll do the project. And so we said, how much will it cost? And he said $750,000. And
quite a bit more than that 150 you
that
thought.
was 1979.
Wow.
And $750,000 would be kind of like price tag at $1.5 to $2 million today, I think.
Yeah.
And so, at any rate, I went back to Dr. Kramer and I said, I guess the project is dead. And he said, well, let's ask him to give it to us. And I said, you're out of your mind. They'll never do that. But he called and he did the ask. And we waited a few weeks and they came back and said, well, this is what we'll do. He says, we will design and build the project, see to it that it's operational. He said, our research and design constitutes about $250,000 of this $750,000. He says, and we will then give you a check for $250,000 at the completion of the project, which you will immediately hand back to us. And okay, so now it was just $500,000 that we had to raise. And so, at any rate, I got on a plane and I went back to Tom Camp in Minneapolis, my friend, that was vice president of control data. And now I had a list of $173,000 worth of specific computer equipment. In those days, the computers were as big as a laundry machine is now, a washer.
Yeah.
And the disk drives were as large or bigger. And they were in special computer rooms. And you had to have special flooring, and you had to have fire extinguisher equipment built in and temperature control. So, at any rate, he looked at the list and he said, most of this is and I just had the name in my head and now I'm blocking out the computer company in Boston, of which Ken Olson was the president. Digital Equipment Corporation, I'm sorry. And he said, why don't you talk to Ken Olson? And he says, I'll give him a call.
Yeah.
So anyway, about a week later, I never did talk to Mr. Olson, but I got a call from his secretary. And she said, Mr. Olson wants to know what he can do for you. And I said, well, we got most of the stuff on our list is digital equipment. And it would help if you could help us with that. And I knew that if I asked for money, they'd give me $10,000 or something. So I said, would it be possible for you to discount some of this? And so about a week, she said she'd talk to Mr. Olson, get back to me. And about a week later, she called me and said, Mr. Olson said he will give you the equipment at our cost, which digital equipment's cost, which was something like $43,000.
Wow.
So now that $129 or $173,000 list went down to 43,000, went down to 43,000. And so then I called Tom Camp and he said, well, we are the original equipment manufacturer for this and this and this, and we can give you that. So now we had 3 big corporations involved, and then Hartford being the insurance capital of the world and heard about the project and sort of called and said, well, we understand you have a big project going on at Gillette or at Newington Children's Hospital rather, and we haven't been asked about this, but what can we do for you more or less? And so several of the insurance companies just sort of spontaneously came up with pretty good sized grants, and first thing we know, we had the lab paid for it. So that's how it started.
That's pretty amazing.
It opened, I think, it opened in June of '81. So it was about 18 months to get it done. Jackie Perry was very annoyed because she'd been working all her life trying to get a gait lab, and then everything she'd done, she'd sort of done by her own hard labor. And all of a sudden, I'm sort of pilot in an F-14, and she's there with a glider.
And yours
And-
was the first clinical gait lab, right?
Yeah, and it was specifically designed. And then Dr. Sutherland was kind enough. He had good software that analyzed the outputs. He just couldn't digitize the inputs. So he came in and offered his software, and so we could hook that on the front end. And so we had a very good head start.
Absolutely.
And, so that opened in July of 1981, and there was no commercial lab available until 1991, 10 years later. So, I didn't really know what I was doing in the beginning, but I read a lot of the works on normal gait. Vern Inman in 1947, when all the amputees were coming back after World War II, he was at Stanford, had been given a big grant to analyze human gait and try to devise better prosthetic devices. And so he had done the studies, marvelous studies. He'd actually gotten medical student volunteers and drilled pins into their bones.
Oh, wow.
And so that he could track the rotations and so on. So, and he had just published a book that year called Human Walking. So I devoured that book. I had read it about 3 times.
Wow.
And we just started from there. And then for 10 years, we kind of picked low-hanging fruit. And then in 1991, I finally finished a little book that was sort of a manual for CP gait analysts. That was what I'd learned in 10 years. It was only 125 pages long. Published by McKeith Press. And at any rate, and then, in the middle of that period, I started trying to figure out how we could get labs commercialized, because everybody would come and they'd want gait labs. We did. Steve Koop was my fellow in 1985, 86, I guess. And he was from the Twin Cities, and the gait lab was running by them and had been for several years. So when he went back to Gillette Children's Hospital, he wanted to have a gait analysis laboratory. And so he put heavy pressure on me, and I put heavy pressure on the administration. And by that time, we had several members of United Technologies on our board of directors. And so they finally got arm twisted enough that they offered to build a second gait lab at Gillette. But they said they would build it at their cost. There was no giveaways. And so they did their own fundraising here and opened the lab in 1987, which was 6 years after ours. And then we updated our lab to current from 81 to 87 standards, which was a big leap in computer processing and so on.
Right.
So that's how it all came to be, but there still were no commercial labs. And so from sort of 86, 87 on, I was trying to figure out how to do that.
Yeah. What would you say were the biggest highlights of your career over this time?
Well, I think we just were picking a lot of low-hanging fruit and figuring out what really was going on.
Yeah.
And if you're going to treat a child with cerebral palsy, it's a lot like solving a math problem. You've got primary problems which are coming out of the brain. These children are born with normal musculoskeletal systems. It's just that the control system has got some disruption to it.
Right.
And the areas that are damaged are different in all of these children. Maybe they're similar, but they're enough different that you can't cookbook it. You have to sort of think, okay, what are the primary problems that are coming from the brain doing to normal locomotion? And then you end up with a list of things that they're doing. And then you look at that list and you sort of say, well, this is solvable, this is not. And you kind of try, again, I sort of solve it like a math problem. And I think my major problem with orthopedics, pediatric orthopedics then and today, is a lot of them tend to cookbook their solutions, C, A, do B, because their professors taught them to do B. And there's a line from HMS Pinafore, where the captain is singing, I always voted at my party's call, and I never thought of thinking of it for myself at all. I thought so little they rewarded me by making me the ruler of the Queen's Navy, and it's sort of that. Yeah. And so I think that there's a lot of resistance. There's still resistance to treating children this way. But I think, we've won some real disciples, and, I could list a handful of them, and most of those are the ones that attend the American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine. And gait labs are now commercially available and springing up. And so that's, I think, what my contribution has been.
Yeah. It's been a huge tool for people. It gives them the ability to really look at the individual movements and determine, what is causing this or that, and the impacts. And I've, as a parent, have been able to skim your book and your little book, and see how you can break things down in ways that you can treat each individual differently, and how that analysis can really help. I think it's a pretty big contribution. Yeah,
and then, as I said, things have come that we couldn't solve back then that we can now, like spasticity.
Yes.
I mean, we've got tools like baclofen, and we have, which really address the muscle more than the spasticity, but nevertheless, it's there. And we have selective dorsal rhizotomy now, which Warwick Peacock brought to this country. I think he immigrated here in 1984.
Yeah.
And there's a story there too. But.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be asking you about that in a second. Well, I'd like to move on. We've got it. We kind of been going on about your career, and I'd like to switch gears for a little bit and talk about your experience with the Academy, and start with how you first got involved with the Academy.
Well, back in 1978, I think, or 77, I now had inherited I guess it was 78, I now inherited the cerebral palsy service. And as Dr. Kramer said, I didn't know much about cerebral palsy. And so I looked up the American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine, and basically the meeting was on the West Coast that year. I think it was in San Francisco, and they had a gait committee. So I went early, and I kind of crashed the meeting of the gait committee. Jackie Perry was the head of it, and she wasn't real pleased with that, as I recall. But at any rate, and then I went to the meeting, and then I started joining committees, and I joined the Academy, and that was sort of the beginning. And the gait committee kind of rambled on for a couple of years, but then by that time we were building our own lab, and it eventually kind of dissolved, but anyway, I was launched by then.
I understand. And then you were president of the Academy in 1991, and but your past president most embarrassing moment actually occurred much earlier than that, during Dr. Scherzer's tenure as president in 1986. And it's another story of crashing things, which involves Dr. Peacock. And I would love for you to tell this story, because it's really a sweet story.
I tend to crash. Bit of a damn, the torpedoes full speed ahead of her. But anyway, well, I don't know, about 1985 or I think it was probably late in 85, people started running into my clinic at Newington Children's Hospital with this issue of the New York Times under their arms, and they all had this article about this neurosurgeon in Los Angeles, and it was an Associated Press article, and it sort of, I think it was overzealously done by the reporter, but it sort of gave you the impression that this person could cure CP. You could reduce spasticity, and so it really kind of annoyed me. So I called him up and got him on the phone, and I said, "Do you happen to have published anything that's not in the New York Times?" And Dr. Peacock was very apologetic and said that yes, he published a great deal. It was all in the South African Medical Journal, and it turned out that he had fled South Africa during the apartheid era as his son came up to be 18 and was about to be drafted, because the Peacock family had been very active in the anti-apartheid movement. And they left in the middle of the night with what they could carry, and ended up in Los Angeles. I think Warwick said he had $200 or $300 in his pocket by the time he got here. And but because he had trained in Toronto in neurosurgery, he was able to get privileges here and join the staff of UCLA, and was working there as a neurosurgeon. And since then he's become a very good friend. But at any rate, we talked on the phone, and we agreed we'd like to meet each other. And so the American Academy happened to be in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Scherzer was president of the Academy. And by that time, I was getting along pretty well with Jackie Perry, and David Sutherland had never been a problem. And we were giving a 2-day instructional course together. And so we did the first day, and then at the end of it, Dr. Peacock walked up and introduced himself and said, "Do you have a few minutes? I'd like to show you some videos up in my hotel room." And so I went up with him, and he showed me these videos whose children, we would do the operations, and we were doing things like rectus femoris transfer, which is a whole other story. But at any rate, but they still had the spasticity. They were still stiff. But all of a sudden, Warwick was showing me pictures of kids who weren't stiff. I mean, they still had their orthopedic problems. I mean, the blending is the secret, I think, of many kids. And but anyway, I was extremely impressed. And so I went down and found Dr. Perry and Dr. Sutherland, told them, and we all went up to the hotel room and we looked at this, and we got quite enthusiastic. And we said, we can make about 20 minutes for you tomorrow on the instructional course if you would like to come and show this. And he agreed. And so we did. And obviously it wasn't peer reviewed. And Dr. Scherzer was very, very angry. Mad as a hornet, as a matter of fact. And he basically just chewed us up and down, and it really kind of split the academy. I mean, about half of the academy was, sort of pro. I mean, it's kind of like the current politics in this country, and half were against. So at any rate, that was sort of the beginning of selective dorsal rhizotomy. But then I invited Dr. Peacock to be a guest at my home for a week, and he came and he stayed. And I got our local neurosurgeon that came to Gillette to scrub with him, and we actually modified his procedure a little bit because we put the posterior elements back, which he wasn't doing, which I think helped to get away from the lordosis and some of the problems. And so anyway, that was sort of the beginning of a fellowship which goes on to this day. I mean, he has a home in Los Angeles still, but he also has now a home in Minnetonka, about 25 miles from here, because his grandchildren, 2 of his grandchildren are up here, 3, I guess now.
Wow.
So at any rate, he drops in once in a while and we see each other.
That's really neat. So Dr. Peacock became one of your dear friends because of the academy, and sounds like Jackie Perry has become one of your dear friends, and Dr. Sutherland, and who else?
They both passed, of course.
Yeah. Who else have been some of your cherished friends and colleagues from the academy?
Oh, there are lots of them. I mean, Bill Bonnell was a good friend. People that came later, Hank Chambers is a good friend. Tom Novacek, who was the first person that we hired. We had hired him as our fellow at Newington Children's Hospital, but I never got to help train him because I left when he walked in the door. But we hired him as soon as he finished because he had come from Wisconsin. See, he's a dear friend. Sarah Winter is marvelous. Bob Winter, who I referred to earlier, is Sarah's father. And Bob has passed, but he was always proud of his accomplishments. And everybody was a little afraid of Dr. Winter. I mean, he was a little fearsome. You didn't want him on the other side. But I always used to kid him that he was the lesser of the 2 winners. Because Sarah worked for us as a developmental pediatrician for a couple of years until she took a job elsewhere out of town.
Mhm.
And she was just marvelous. She could do anything. She could do intensive care. She could do
Yeah.
developmental pediatrics. And just, I never saw her not smiling, happy. She's just a wonderful person.
Yeah.
So that's another, but there are many. You could go through them.
Yeah. It's been an amazing academy, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's neat to see how they've cherished you as well. They certainly have embraced you and loved you. It's pretty amazing.
And Jean South, the therapist here, she's still at Gillette.
Yeah.
We were giving a conference at the East Coast Gait Lab conference.
Yeah.
Sutherland had started a West Coast Gait Lab conference. So I thought, okay, we'll start an East Coast Gait Lab conference. So Jean Stout had just finished her training in North Carolina and came and stopped by and went to this conference. And she was on her way back to Wisconsin. And this was in 86 or early 87, I can't remember, probably 86. But anyway, she said, do you know of any jobs in gait analysis? And I said, well, they're going to build one at Gillette. Why don't you go see Steve Coop, who, as I mentioned earlier. So she did, and she was hired before the lab even got in there. So, and she's still in the lab.
Yeah. So one of the things that you've mentioned to me is something you were proud of during your tenure was your nominations.
Yeah, I think before, in the previous president's list, I don't have it in front of me, but I don't think there's been a woman president. There was a woman that was in with the founding.
Early on, yeah.
Early on, but I don't know whether she ever was president per se. And so when you finish your presidency, you become the head of the nominating committee. And so, and I have to credit my late wife for this too, because she was very strongly pro-women and pro-women's rights, as she should be. And so anyway, when I finished my or when I got to be president of the nominating committee, I nominated Helen Horstman, who's another dear friend that I should have mentioned earlier. And then, as it turned out, they changed the system that year because there was now going to be a president and a president-elect, and so we had to nominate two people. So then the other one I nominated was Charlene Butler, who is also a good friend and had been head of the committee that I was working on. I can't even remember what the committee was about anymore, but Charlene was the head of it. And so, at any rate, so I'm sort of proud that I nominated the first two women presidents of the Academy.
Yeah, and they both truly appreciated that about you, and both of them talked about that during their interview as well. And I remember Dr. Horstman mentioning Jean Black as well, and during her interview.
And Jean Black was a good friend.
Yeah.
And I had all of these people here as visiting professors for we had essentially an alumni day, once a year when we have a conference. And so
that's really neat. I mean, it's pretty special that to me to see this group of people that you guys can come together and have this team and this multidisciplinary team of folks that care so deeply about the treatment of children and now adults too with CP and then become such good friends and have these relationships, and to see you and Dr. Peacock, still have this relationship years and years later. And I have a feeling that Dr. Scherzer has let go of that anger. And
Al and I are good friends as well. I think we both laugh about it.
So you had some really great advice that I thought was fun, the way you talk about it, for just way Academy members can think about walking and gait. And I was hoping you might talk about it for just a second.
I made the point earlier that children are born with a normal musculoskeletal system, but they just have a brain injury, which is and they're growing, and And growing bones behave like soft plastic or soft lead, in that if your forces, the forces of walking that are generated with walking are normal, the bones will take their normal shape. And if they're abnormal, they won't. And I think up to the time we started doing gait analysis, all of the emphasis was really on muscles, with the exception of maybe the feet. You know, they would, if the feet were severely deformed, they'd fix them. But, you know, rarely would they, or if the hip was dislocating, they'd fix that. But they really didn't think about the bones as being the levers upon which the muscles act. And so I would, when I was teaching residents about cerebral palsy and its effect, we'd start talking about the primary effects, which are the brain injury, the secondary effects, which are caused by the brain injury, and the tertiary effects, which are the coping responses, if you will, that the kid ends up using to get around. You know, if you can't bend your knee because it's stiff, you circumvent to come through. And so you don't want to operate on the circumduction. You want to operate on the secondary problem, and if you can get at it, which is usually spasticity, or else the fact that the biarticular muscles, the two joint muscles, in this case, the rectus femoris, is not working normal.
Yeah.
And that's another story that we can talk about later. Jackie Perry and I had a conversation one time. But at any rate, so I would always tell my residents, this is just a Star Wars principle. Let the force be with you. If the forces are normal, your bones take the normal shape. If they're abnormal, they twist or deform. Mm-hmm. And those twists are important to correct. I think one of the biggest contributions we can make as pediatric orthopedic surgeons is to straighten the skeleton, and that is the entire skeleton. And the other thing we did with gait analysis is try to do a single stage surgery where we would analyze which muscles had to be addressed and which bones had to be addressed, and do it with two teams of surgeons at the same time. Because these kids were getting this, Mercer Rang used to make this point about the birthday syndrome. These kids were getting an operation every birthday and therapy all year long, and their childhood was just a horror show. So the idea was to do a single stage intervention, and then hopefully, other than taking out perhaps some hardware, not be coming back. And so that's, I think, another thing that we pioneered was Mercer Rang talked about it, Gene Beck talked about it, but we did it. We actually started doing single stage surgery. So I'm proud of that as well.
That's a quality of life impact that I can speak to, and I think every individual with cerebral palsy who has undergone a surgery or multiple surgeries can certainly attest to as well. And that's a pretty huge impact that you've made. How do you want to be remembered?
Oh, I guess I'd like to be remembered for the person that tried to make pediatric orthopedics things more like bioengineers rather than cooks. You know, I think if you're going to be a cerebral palsy surgeon, I mean, you can be a good hip replacement surgeon and pretty much cookbook it, or knee replacements or whatever you want to do. But I think if you're going to do something as complex as cerebral palsy, number one, you've got to analyze it and lay out your problem list and make sure that problem list is pretty accurate. And two, then you've got to go through that list and, as I say, try to optimize the treatment, solving it like a math problem, and be open to new ways and new techniques. You know, in the 10 years that I had that lab, without really other people having lab, and we were learning, picking the low-hanging fruit, I discovered that just about everything I've been taught by my mentors and professors was wrong. I mean, you know, you don't lengthen the heel cord. That's the worst thing you can do. The gastrocnemius is a combination of the soleus, which is a single joint muscle, and the gastrocnemius, which is a biarticular muscle. The biarticular muscles are fast twitch. They get confused very easily, and they tend to think about what's happening at the upper end. In other words, the gastrocs spans the knee and the ankle, it tends to think of itself more as an ankle flexor, and the rectus femoris spans the hip and the knee, and it tends to think of itself as a hip flexor because it can't do that split section action that's required. It's kind of like, and the soleus underneath is what we call a slow twitch muscle as opposed to a fast twitch muscle. And so I always, being a farm boy when I grew up, I always likened it to a team of horses. I had a riding horse when I was on the farm who was a fairly spirited cow pony. We'd go out of Montana. And when my uncle that I lived with still liked to plant with horses, and he liked to mow with horses. We had a small farm. And so the Duke, Nell, the older horse, passed on. And so we were left with a single horse, and my uncle, being a frugal man, figured that this cow pony shouldn't stand around. So he tried to hook Thunder up to Duke. And it sort of mimicked the gastric soleus. He had this one horse that was just prancing and dancing around, and the other one that was just plodding, and my uncle swearing at it in Norwegian. So that went on for about 3 weeks, and then he went out and bought another horse. But anyway, we learned things like that, and we learned to do gastrocnemius recession and not heel cord lengthening. We learned how to address crouch gait, and in fact how to take kids out of crouch gait once they were in it, and just a host of things like that. And even if you don't have gait analysis, if you've trained in an area that has gait analysis, you have a basic understanding of normal gait, and you have a basic understanding of pathology. So even with a good iPhone and slow motion video, you can with your knowledge use that to make some better decisions. I mean, gait analysis is the best, but when I went to Ecuador annually, we didn't have gait analysis, and so we'd do things like that. And I think we still did pretty good treatment.
What gives you hope?
Well, I've hoped in vain a few times, but I think it's coming. At the beginning, in 1981, when I was assigned a team from UTC to build the gait analysis, I had 4 engineers working with me, and we couldn't talk to each other. And so I ended up taking 5 computer classes back in 1981. And just so we could kind of talk a common language. And there was a lot of computer fear at that time. I kept thinking, oh, well, 5, 6, 7 years, everybody will be over that. And a lot of people that are resistant to will retire. Well, that didn't quite happen. I think it finally sort of has. The commercialization of gait analysis is good. But, pediatric orthopedics constitutes about, I would say, well, it constituted probably 70% of my practice, but cerebral palsy did. But I would say that in most practices, even if you're out in a small, 20,000 person community or something, it's probably going to be 25% of your cases. And I think that these people that are out there should still be cognizant of gait. The surgeries aren't difficult to do, but they should be sending their kids into a gait lab center for analysis, getting the recommendations of a gait lab, and then at least considering those as they plan their surgery. But a lot of people are still resistant to gait analysis because if you don't want to use it, or if you don't have the availability to use it, there's a tendency to throw stones at it because you don't want to give up that significant portion of your practice. And I think I still get a little discouraged about that.
But what gives you hope?
Well, I mean, it's getting simpler.
It's changing.
Gait analysis is getting simpler, and the software is getting better and better,
Yeah.
so that
that you can.
I mean, I always used to say that doctors can ask the questions, but they can't answer them.
Yeah.
Engineers can answer the questions, but they don't know what the proper questions are. And without guidance, they'll go after kind of silly things that don't really help you a lot clinically. But if you're really working in a team, as we did in the Gate laboratory, you can go to your engineer and say, look, this is a problem. And that's the way we developed kinetics back in 1990, is kinetics can actually tell you what muscles are providing power at any stage in the gait. And I went to Roy Davis, the engineer, and said, this is something we really need to have. And I said, Winter, this is a different Winter, that was up in Canada. I said, Dr. Winter really is using kinetics and has developed that. And so Roy Davis worked with a master's degree student, and they programmed that. We published that in 1991. And, that's a huge addition to gait analysis.
Yeah.
And so, I think just the idea of team treatment, working together, having everybody on the same page. I'll get in trouble with a physiatrist, but I think botulinum toxin is overused. And I think, again, we should be working in concert. There's certainly a place for it. But repetitive injections into the same muscle group can damage the muscles. So, if you work in teams and can talk to one another and can figure out a way, and when I came back as medical director of Gillette, that's one reason I came here, was to try to really integrate team treatment into the program.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Gage, I've really enjoyed this interview, and I feel like there's so much more that we haven't talked about Ecuador as much as I don't know if you'd like to talk a little bit about your work there just for a minute or so, if we could add it in, as part of, you didn't talk about it when you were talking about some of your career highlights, you didn't mention it.
Well, that happened probably about 1990. By that time, my kids were grown and out of the house, and I went to a Christian Medical Society meeting here in the Twin Cities, and there was a man by the name of Dr. Swanson, who came up from Ecuador. He had been a Twin City resident, but he was a missionary down there, and he started talking about this hospital in Quito that started sounding like a very sophisticated hospital. And so anyway, I went up and I talked to him afterward, and he invited me to come down and look at it to see if we could do something together. So long story short, two couples, an orthopedic friend of mine and his wife and my wife, went down there together and thought we were going on holiday, and I ended up doing, 10 or 12 surgeries, I think. And at any rate, then I came back the next year, and there was a Lutheran missionary from Germany by the name of Eckhard Wolf, who was sort of the orthopedic surgeon for the poor, because there are orthopedists in Ecuador, but they charge, and he was a missionary and worked for free. And so he started collecting patients for me to see. And then pretty soon, Dr. Dallin here in town called and asked if he could come down. And then Steve Koop started coming down. And then by that time, I was doing a lot of lecturing in South America, and they would want to come up to Gillette. And I'd say, well, that's expensive, and the attorneys won't let you near the table if you're not licensed. And so I said, why don't you come to Quito? Because I go there annually for 3 weeks or more. And I said, I can use your Spanish and we can learn together. And so we started getting residents. And so I went down there for 18 years, every year, sometimes twice, occasionally 3 times. And the program actually, after I quit going down there, went on for another, 10 years or so. It just stopped sort of at COVID. And they're trying to figure out how to restart it now. But at any rate, we would be met usually. We had about 10 different doctors from countries like Colombia and Brazil, Argentina, Chile, that would come up, and I would kind of book. I was there for 3 weeks, so I kind of divide the group into 3, and these people would come up and operate, and I'd always have 2 surgeons down there from the United States. By that time, it was really Gillette surgeons. And there was a lot of camaraderie that was developed, and we really, I think, helped a fair number of people. And the hospital had a free care fund, so that we keep them hospitalized, and the therapists got involved. Several therapists from our hospital and from Gillette went down, spent time with the therapists at Hospital Sundays. So that was another very serendipitous thing, that providential thing that came out of this.
Dr. Gage, I'm tremendously grateful that you told us about Ecuador, because it just, again, exemplifies all that you've done for individuals with cerebral palsy and the difference that you've made in the lives of children, not just here in the US or Connecticut or at Gillette, but internationally, and training people worldwide, and really, taking it to a new level and looking at each individual and looking at the way their brain and their muscles and their bones work and how they work together and how they don't necessarily work together, and how you can treat each individual as an individual. And I don't know how best to say it, but I know that you can know that you have changed the world and for people with CP. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I very much enjoyed talking to you.